there's a commercial in the middle for, is it Genki Forest or something? And it's these like, just what struck me as funny is how much they're talking about how the drink has no calories and no sugar. And it's like, you've been doing back-breaking labor for like a week. And first of all, you're already rail thin and you're burning like 4,000 calories a day and exerting yourself like you never had. And you're just really concerned that your like hydration will have too many calories in it.
Today we're doing something a little different. Pilot talk on ChinaTalk. I have with us today Trey Colmer, a television writer who currently writes for Ghosts on CBS and is on strike, so has nothing better to do than join myself as well, Irene Zhang, a longtime ChinaTalk editor, to talk about hot new Chinese television pilots, which, if this strike keeps going long enough, may be the only new television that there is to watch in the coming months and years. We're going to be discussing some really fun new shows which have come out. Zhongdiba, a reality show that takes like young handsome men from cities and like tries to turn them into farmers. We have English name The Long Season, a 9.4 on Douban, which is basically the highest score any show has gotten in years. It's a 12 episode long murder mystery set in Dongbei. I'm like a huge fan of The Watch, which is an American like TV discussion show. And so this is my pale imitation of trying to do that in English about Chinese television. So over the course of the episode, I'll give sort of short little introductions about what these shows are. But I do think if you're interested in the shows, well, there won't be spoilers because we're only talking about the pilots. But I do think you'll be able to enjoy this conversation more if you watch the episodes. There's English subtitles for all of them, and I'll put the links for the YouTube videos in the description. And with that, let's kick it off. Trey and Irene, welcome to ChinaTalk.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very excited to be here.
Okay. Let's start out with like the most absurd, which I guess is this which I guess is this reality show. Trey, Irene, what were your first impressions of life on the farm?
My first reaction was it was just sort of mesmerizing watching people farm, and that there was so much less conflict than an American reality show. I think for more than half of it, they're just farming and stuff's going well. They're all getting along. Maybe a harvester gets stuck. But it was way set up less of people just at each other's throats from the beginning. I had a question. Is there like a stereotype that we're supposed to assume these kids coming in are? Like, are these supposed to be big city kids coming out to the country, or kind of, how's that supposed to be understood?
My understanding is that they were scouted from, like not all of them were pretty much supposed to be in the entertainment industry already. Like, they're very attractive people. And I think we are meant to go in with the assumption that at least they haven't been subject to that kind of hardship before. They're not necessarily extremely privileged financially, I guess not necessarily, but they are from urban areas and they probably, haven't a tractor day in their life.
Yeah, I think some of them, they all, like most of them, particularly the super handsome ones, have some sort of entertainment background. Like they went to like an acting university, or like they've been on other sort of small roles in television shows. So, it's not like just people on the street who want to learn how to farm, though I think that's some of them. There is a mix between these folks with like the, who want to be singers, and then others who are just like, I'm going to do some weird thing for 8 months.
Yeah, it was funny. I was reading some reviews, and one of the things that a lot of people kept saying on Chinese forums was, wow, the kids are so polite these days. Because it's kind of like, it's like the whole like anti-Kardashian thing is that like these boys are sort of remarkably composed in the face of adversity and never really yell at each other.
It sort of flows down, I think, from what the vision of the show was, which is to have this be a kind of like relaxing watch. There's lots of other, even if like interpersonal drama is not necessarily at the heart of a lot of Chinese reality television shows. Others are shot much faster. Like there are quicker cuts. There's all this like stuff popping up on the screen, and they have these like extreme challenges, or they're put in weird situations, and like things have to be moving really fast, and they're driving around or whatever. But I think it was very smart casting on the part of them to not have them be fighting with each other all the time, because like another theme of the show, I think, is like these urban city dweller handsome actor people like finding out a way to respect, learn from, and live together with the nongmin, the farmers, who are like at first very clearly sort of annoyed and frustrated that these young kids are in their life and their neighborhood all of a sudden.
Yeah, they were all very deferential to the farmers, and I this show, it almost had like an ASMR element to it. Of even without the conflict, or if there was no harvester getting stuck, I kind of just loved watching them cut the wheat, and when they would dump it in the big dump truck and when they would dump it out, it was so pleasing. But Tom, he's not a polite young man. He's giving it to the farmers.
Yeah, so basically in the mini arc there was this young guy who like thought he knew how to drive the tractor, and like very quickly 5-6 old local tractor driver farmers start like laughing at him, and they tell him once or twice, you should do this, you should do that. He's like, no, I got it. Like, I know how to drive a car. Leave me alone, you hillbillies. And then of course he like gets it stuck in the mud, and it becomes this whole thing that like the farmers like absolutely knew it was coming, and then like they have to help him by like towing him out and getting planks for the mud or whatever. But it was played very, it was very like low key, the whole the way they shot it and showed it in the show. Again, it wasn't like folks screaming at each other.
There's a commercial in the middle for, is it Genki Forest or something? And it's these like, just what struck me as funny is how much they're talking about how the drink has no calories and no sugar. And it's like, you've been doing back-breaking labor for like a week. And first of all, you're already rail thin, and you're burning like 4,000 calories a day and exerting yourself like you never had. And you're just really concerned that your like hydration will have too many calories in it.
That was just the most unintentionally funny part to me as well, is that Genki Forest, which for context is basically Chinese LaCroix, is such a bizarre sponsor for this whole thing. And it's so prominent, they just keep drinking it, and it's like, what Chinese village are you going to the convenience store and just have like a whole wall of this stuff?
Yeah, so the way Chinese ads work on sponsored reality shows is it's sort of this like whole package deal where in the show they're only allowed to drink one thing, and then like at every meal it will be sort of like very prominently placed with a label facing towards the camera, as well as like the most popular either actors or I guess like participants in this case will in commercials it'll be like cut out of the real life, and they'll be on a soundstage or whatever and saying like, I really love to eat this thing, or I really love to drink this thing. It's even more jarring when it's for like a period piece TV show, because then you see the actors who are still sort of in character sometimes go out and say like, here's this like milk brand, even though I'm like shooting a show that's set in 1930 Shanghai, but like if it was around then, I certainly would have drank it. Like weird mismatching that goes on with product placement, particularly for foodstuffs.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, after it occurred to me, we didn't talk about the down to the countryside movement during the Cultural Revolution, where basically to sort of cool off the Cultural Revolution, Mao decided to send tens, hundreds of thousands of city-dwelling young people into the countryside to learn how to farm, to sort of, I guess, like, re-educate them in the ways of the people. And obviously this is not something that in the first 15 episodes of watching this show I've seen, but is an interesting sort of parallel to think about, that now we're in this sort of like post-industrialized universe where wealthy, educated young people in big urban Chinese cities are seeing this as something like cute to go and grow crops, whereas in the 1960s and 70s it had a very, very different cultural and political context.
So let's turn to the second show of today's discussion, the Long Season, the biggest hit since Kwangbiao, the knockout. I guess like murder is on the minds. Well, I guess everyone likes murder shows, but this pilot was really something. Trey, what intrigued you about it?
I sound like a rube, but I had to watch it twice. With the subtitles go very fast when they're speaking. I found I really loved the present day stuff the most. It had like a real momentum to it. It's just one thing leads to the next. He bought a car, he got ripped off. It's clear you have this guy who knows what he's doing and his friend who's kind of an idiot and a show off. And he buys this car. He thinks he gets an amazing deal on the taxi. So he's going to, instead of sharing a taxi, have his own. And it was a ripoff. It's got a lot of damage. And then he is set up for to take the fall for some sort of hit and run. And it just feels like each scene has momentum. They get right to the next thing. The police impound the car, and he can't get the car until he, I guess, is exonerated for the hit and run. So he asks where the victim is, and he says, "Where's the hospital?" And you just cut straight to the hospital. It felt like there was a nice pacing and a momentum. And then I can't tell if I was missing stuff in some of the translation, but I lost the thread a little bit in you cut back 20 years and you see where he was in the late 90s in this kind of factory town that's on hard times. And I think the factory was shut down because someone went missing and the resources weren't available to run the factory. Is that right?
Yeah. I guess it wasn't really made clear whether the factory was shut down because of the murder. But it was implied that it contributed to it, at least in the pilot. I agree about the translation thing. Is that it? Unfortunately, the show on YouTube is pretty badly subtitled in English, and partly because, so just for context, this show is set in kind of like a fictional northeastern town in China. Quite a bit of dialogue is delivered in kind of regional northeastern dialect, which is understandable to people who speak Mandarin, but there are some specific expressions and kind of even ways of speech in it that doesn't really translate well.
Yeah, I struggled a little bit with the Chinese, and was sort of turning subtitles on and off over the time. It's really funny because Tencent, there was one line where they're a grenade apparently is beer in Dongbei Hua, which I didn't know, but they gave you a little explanation for it, and I was like, thank you, Tencent, but you guys should have done that 20 times because there are all these other weird phrases of men in their 60s in northeastern China, which I'm not particularly familiar with. But yeah, so following through to the plot, we have we sort of flick back to the 1990s, and it turns out that somebody got chopped up, and we're sort of left on this big cliffhanger about how this connects to how the sort of taxi driver who knows how to get things done, how this relates to his family, and exactly what he's going to do about it, to sort of solve the case all the way up in 2016. I thought the music was fantastic. You had this mix of jazzy stuff. There were horns. There was piano. There was some rock music. This even this long violin intro, which I thought was just really good scene setting. I mean, having not lived in Dongbei in 2016, presumably this must have been something on the radio at the time, but it really did give a sense of place for me, at least. Irene, what about the show struck out for you?
I mean, there was one point where I was really wowed by the writing. So there was one point where the guy who just couldn't get his car back, this was, I think, in the flashback where he went to he went back to his house, where his wife, who seems to be some sort of esthetician, who runs her own business in their home, and she was working on a client, and he comes back, he sits down, he turns on the TV, and his wife's client was like just a bit too noisy, and kind of subtly implying that she would prefer if the husband shut it off, and he just totally like misses all the cues in a point that's like almost very embarrassing, and then he just kind of gives orders for his wife, who's in the middle of serving her client, to make him some food. And yeah, it was like it translates well at that point, because like that's something that you get in Western media as well, the sort of make me a sandwich kind of thing, but just in a very Chinese context. And it's hard to kind of describe it without showing the thing, but the writing, I think, was really striking in the way the pacing and the tone works to show how little he thought of his wife's work laid right in front of him.
One of the things I think a lot of Chinese shows have struggled with is like bad guys. Oftentimes they're sort of too cartoonish, or I don't know. You having like realistic negative characters, I imagine, is something that like very quickly you start to get in trouble if you sort of there are lots of ways where you can get yourself in trouble by writing bad guys, and this show felt a lot more like an indie movie, I think, in those scenes where it was really specific, and there was a ton of atmosphere in like giving him this characterization of like being someone who's like really disrespectful. Trey, anything about those scenes in particular that struck out to you?
Well, yes. It was very unpleasant in like a cool way. I think we see less of that specific dynamic on Western shows right now, and yeah, it felt. I mean, to me, it felt kind of fresh, and felt, as you said, very specific. I thought one interesting thing was that the main character in the flashback with his family was like very dismissive and disrespectful, and unappreciative of what he had with his wife and his son, and it feels like a bit of a flip on how these things are usually done, where usually it's the character in the past has dealt with some trauma, and he's kind of hardened himself to the world, and now he's like mean, and he doesn't care about people, and he needs to get through that in the end to kind of solve whatever problem he's trying to solve. Whereas in this show, it feels like the main character is kind of in the present, not actualized. He has something he wants to solve, but he's like, seems like he has stuff figured out. He seems like a good guy. He has a son in the present who he appreciates and wants to go on a trip with. And then you cut back to before this. I don't know how much to spoil. I had to read ahead to kind of understand what's going on. But he ends up, facing a tragedy that seems like it turned him from a curmudgeon into a more appreciative guy. If that makes sense. It kind of feels like a flip on how that stuff usually goes.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I don't want to read into this too much in a sort of like very culturalist relative thing, but I wonder part of it just because kind of Western narratives prefer that kind of like salvation from trauma thing going on. And that's not really something that I guess is as salient for a Chinese audience. And it's not, there isn't really that similar kind of expectation that a character's past trauma will kind of make them an antagonist.
Oh, that's so interesting. Because I feel like in Western shows, so much of it, almost every main character has their past trauma that they need to come to terms with in order to solve whatever they're trying to solve. It kind of, yeah, I'd be curious to see more shows and kind of see what fills the gap of, Don Draper just needs to share with his family what his childhood was really like so they can understand him, or kind of what fills that trope.
And Trey, I'd actually love to hear your take on, I mean, just following up from that line of the difference in narratives. There was one, I don't know how far along the synopsis you read, but I mean, not to spoil stuff, but the kind of the long narrative of the show is about a woman seeking revenge after a lot of pretty horrific trauma, and in a very dark way. And I'm curious what you think about that take, because to me, it struck me as something that's fresh in Chinese media, but is done a lot in the West, from like Killing Eve and whatnot.
Yeah, so that's how the season goes. It becomes there's a woman who becomes one of the main protagonists. That's so interesting. I mean, the thing that reminds me of is Kill Bill. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a Quentin Tarantino 2 movies that's very clear. Woman's been horribly wronged and she is on a mission for revenge. I think, and it goes, way back. There's like, Count of Monte Cristo. It's kind of like a genre. But it's very easy to write when the main character has just such a clear thing they want, and every scene can be them trying to pursue that thing. Once you have that thing, or once one of those like tropes kind of enters the language of the television shows people are putting on, I could see other creators wanting to just use that to help propel their stories.
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess the reason that felt fresh for me in terms of the Chinese media context is that there is a kind of, in that tradition of like Kill Bill and like that sort of murdery women narrative, you have that in the kind of Chinese tradition, but usually in the more kind of traditional literature sense, like the wronged woman kills herself, not other people. And
oh wow,
like it to a Chinese audience is subverting something they're more familiar with.
So yeah, I think like 2 years ago, the show Why Women Kill, which was a U.S. network drama with like Lucy Liu, who just like murders her husband for. It's like 4 different interweaving stories of like women who murder their husbands. Went very viral in China, perhaps because, as you said, Irene, like this niche isn't necessarily being filled today by contemporary Chinese television. One thing I wanted to talk about was the cinematography. There were some very like fun, creative shots that went on in this pilot. The first one in particular, where like you start in the sky and then pan down to a taxi driver peeing in a cornfield, I thought was like a great way to sort of set the tone of the show. And there was also another one towards the end where you had this like kind of like 360, like where time, like the way they did the time travel from 97 to 2016, where the camera sort of like pans around him and it goes from sunny to like sad and rainy and he's crying. I thought was like very artfully done and not something a lot of Chinese TV shows like invest time and money into pulling off.
The tension of that 360 when it's like they're hinting something's wrong and this isn't like reality and you just kind of can sense it's going to reveal his son isn't there. I agree that I thought that was really cool.
The whole sort of cat and mouse thing where they're trying to not show the dismembered body is interesting. There was like that kind of window thing in front of the person who was investigating it, and people kind of were the kind of multi-layer spectacle of people trying to look in from the window, but then there's like the cordon off area outside where a lot of people were looking at it, and then there you have the what seems to be the character's son at the top of that slow crying, and when you picture that, like it's sort of that all those layers are revealed at different points, but as you finally are able to picture the whole thing in 3D form when you see the son, I think that was also really striking to me.
So in general, for Chinese television, gore and sex are not even PG-13. Basically, We're sort of at like a PG level. People die. So there is a dismemberment. You do not see it, of course, which I think you would like almost expect if you're watching, Game of Thrones or or some American non-network TV show. Sex also is something that like doesn't happen. Like the only time you really see like bodies that are getting blown up is in war movies where it's supposed to like elicit feelings of patriotism and pathos like towards the PLA. Outside of that context, like murder shows are not going to have anything super gory, which is an interesting thing to note. Like a creative box that Chinese creators end up having to work their way around in cool ways, like you just mentioned, Irene.
Yeah, in this case, I think it works, right? Like the whole sort of unspeakable nature of it is what makes it kind of very tense.
Yeah, it's almost more creepy to have like body parts in like a grocery plastic bag than it is to see them, strewn out all over a house or something. I think just like Dongbei personalities are so good and fun to watch. Like most of the popular comedians nowadays come from Dongbei. We have this sort of like dry, sharp humor, like is really good on screen, I think. So regionalisms aside, it was really fun and engaging Chinese to listen to, and recommend folks check it out. I wanted to close with one of the coolest series that Billy put out over the past few months. It's called中国奇谭, and it's 8 20-minute animated shorts, all from different directors and like wildly different visual styles, which tell sort of like fables or just like little arcs. And there was some real interesting creativity that I think got put into them. So, Irene, what did you think was cool about it?
Yeah, I guess just for context, the first episode is involves this little monster who's in this monster clan slash company town, who decides to give up the monster. Eventually, decides to give up the monster art because he finds it really awful, and tries to support the bright side instead. And it's a really cool reverse narrative. If you know the original story is from one of the kind of 4 classics Chinese literature, is the Journey to the West. And in the original story, it was the heroes, the good monk and his disciples going around and defeating all these monsters. And in the story, it was seen from a monster's perspective, which is already pretty fun. And there's a pretty deeper philosophical part to this. You can read it in a, I guess, very spiritual sense. I'm not gonna spoil the whole thing, but in the little monster's final decision of like, to what extent are we as individuals responsible for the things that big structures bigger than us do. I read this very interesting Douban review that read it from a Marxist perspective of kind of the little monster's relationship with the monster company being this alienation from labor, and how his defection is him deciding to kind of abandon capitalism. That was really interesting. I mean, personally, I still read it in that more moral sense of how we as individuals cope with working in bad systems.
That's so interesting to hear that, because I was watching it and I was thinking, is this meant to be subversive at all over there? Because I was reading it as like, this feels like a critique of a stereotype of communism, of they're getting the bureaucracy is creating this waste and it's beating down anyone who's trying to improve the system. But it's so interesting to hear that it is probably meant to be perceived as a critique of capitalism.
Oh no, not at all. I think the Marxism thing is probably a kind of slightly niche reading. I agree with you. I think when I first watched it, I was like, this feels a bit subversive in how it discusses power and how one individual imagines your agency in the face of belonging to a totally controlling system that you see as doing evil but don't have control over. Like whether or not it is valuable to make yourself the sacrifice to make that point. And I think the side, you can read it as the very Chinese politics kind of view of it. You can also read it in the longer Chinese literary tradition of there being a lot of traditional stories and literature and like historical stories of people who this idea of like the loyal opposition of someone who sacrifices themselves to show the injustice of society. And yeah, I think you don't have to read it as politically subversive in its current moment, but you can understand it as part of that.
When these these traditional stories, did the monsters represent some group or some like group within Chinese society at the time, or was it just kind of a mythological, domain of creatures?
I'm sure there are literary scholars who have tried to study it. If you're just a sort of popular reader, like someone who enjoys it for the stories, that you're not really meant to read the monsters as explicit caricatures. There are some that are. There are some that are like, the drunk bar owner or like this evil woman who eats people or whatnot. But if it starts to just the sort of animalistic monsters, it's just sort of meant as this sort of abstraction of chaotic evil, I think, is my understanding of it. But I mean, in this case, there was one moment, I don't know if you guys remember it, but that I really liked was when the little monster goes back to his family. And he was like, oh, my job is so hard. And his mom is very nice towards him and gives him food, drinks. And they talk about it almost as if it's kind of just your average company job that a young person might have in China. And there was that really interesting contrast between this little monster's moral struggle with his job being part of, great evil. And you can also just consider it part of mundane daily life.
Another thing that struck out to me about this episode was the background, which is like, they hired traditional Chinese landscape painters to do the environments, which I thought was really fun. If you go forward to other episodes, you'll see sort of there's some 3D animation. There's different styles of like painting which go on. It's really exciting to watch something where every 20 minutes you just get like an entirely new sort of visual breath of fresh air. The one I think really, another one that really struck out to me was episode 7, which is a story of like an old man living in a Beijing hutong who ends up having to move, and like he has this like beautiful interaction with all of the like the animals and the stone lions that he's been living with for the past 75 years in like a very cool sort of like 3D world. Yeah, it's really fun seeing sort of like fresh visual stuff. And I think because you're condensed to 20 minutes as opposed to, having to do a feature movie or like having a long-standing animated show, like you can really take some bigger swings and try to make more complicated stuff. Presumably the Billy budget that these different directors got made was enough to make some very interesting looking shows, because that's what we end up getting here.
That's cool. Yeah. Although it can be like expensive to make new sets in animated. There were like a lot of different locations, and every location, I guess they need to design what it looks like. And it just looked like so much work went into those 20 minutes that I'm surprised they're able to do it where every episode has a different look and they have to redesign and recreate all those assets for every episode. It's like really impressive. I think this was my favorite of all of them, but I was just kind of Loved how it looked. Loved the little boar, and yeah, was enjoying it the whole way through.
There was kind of a previous golden age of Chinese animation in the late 90s, and when there were a couple of state-owned animation firms that did very like gorgeous, like very traditional Chinese art inspired animation films based on traditional stories. I part of me reads this show as a homage to that a little bit. I wish we would do more of this.
Yeah, there's a there's like a very sad arc in 20th century Chinese animation, because like you had some really incredible stuff in the 50s and 60s, and then a lot of the folks were like part of old culture, and there was some Cultural Revolution stuff which ended up really taking a bite out of the sort of talent and trajectory of Chinese anime. And there's been a lot of it's been a long road to get and I think like over the past few years, you've seen a number of 3D animated movies do particularly well. But I think 3D animation is kind of stupid. So it's fun seeing 2D 2D showcased in such a dramatic way. Cool. All right. This was fun. This was different. ChinaTalk listeners interested. It'd be fun to have like a rotating cast of characters cast of like participants to join this discussion. I feel like we could keep this up once a month or something. There'll be plenty of other new shows coming down the pipeline. So if you're interested in joining this conversation next time, or have shows you've enjoyed that you want to discuss on the show, reach out. Thanks so much.